This is the last and final part of this particular online lecture. In the previous lecture, or the previous portion of this lecture, I asked you to look up and utilize information on penetrance and expressivity, and I directed you where to go on that. I gave you the example of PKU, or phenylketonuria, as a genetic condition that can be managed by diet, i.e. an example of gene-environment interaction. And we also looked at some examples of sex-limited and sex-influenced traits, specifically lactation and male pattern baldness. And we talked about gene silencing and Barr body formation, or mosaicism. Let's consider now, briefly, the topic of non-nuclear inheritance. Non-nuclear inheritance typically or most commonly refers to mitochondrial inheritance and also chloroplast inheritance. Let's focus in this example on mitochondrial inheritance. This is also referred to as maternal inheritance. Let's think about the formation of new diploid organisms such as ourselves. Here's an egg cell on the left, and here's a sperm cell in the middle of this figure. This is not drawn to scale. Egg cells are typically massive, absolutely massive, and sperm cells are actually really, really tiny in almost all animals. So just remember that. Okay, so you've got this massive egg, and the egg is really complex, and it's a little bit more typical in terms of what you know about eukaryotic cells. It has many different mitochondria, and the mitochondria are shown here in red. Okay, sperm cells are very tiny, and they are highly specialized cells intended for fertilization. And in the head of the sperm, okay, you have nuclear DNA. So it's there in haploid form, but it's nuclear DNA. And the mitochondria are confined to a particular area of the sperm, just at the place where the flagellum links onto the sperm head. Okay, so you want to note here that you don't have a lot of mitochondria in this area. Okay, now this arrow is showing fertilization. All right, so sperm and egg fuse, and then you obtain a diploid, okay, nucleus. So you've got all 23 pairs of chromosomes in a human. One member of the pair is from the father. It came in on the sperm. The other member was there in the egg nucleus. And then you've got all of these maternal mitochondria. So every one of these red mitochondria they were already there in the egg. Okay, so they are there from the mother, right? They are not from the father. They're from the mother. Okay, so because of this, any genes that are found on those mitochondria are maternally inherited. You can't get mitochondrial genes from your father, at least very rarely. Okay, thinking a little bit about the mitochondria, which are shown in this figure, just to give you a little background to this figure, you'll notice on the left-hand side in this cell over here, okay, and there's the nucleus here, and all of these little guys are mitochondria. And you'll notice that some are red and some are green. And that is not in this figure denoting maternal or paternal inheritance. Okay, the thing about mitochondria, there are quite a few. There's a lot known about them and a lot still to learn. Mitochondria have haploid genomes. They're probably derived from an evolutionary perspective from the endosymbiosis of a prokaryote, a bacterium, much like some of the bacteria that are found on Earth today. And so they have haploid genomes, they have one chromosome, and they tend to not have introns and so on. And the thing is that they reproduce through a process that is probably like binary fission. And so over time, you can actually have mitochondria within the cell that are a little bit different one from the other. And that heterogeneity is implied here in the red and green mitochondria. Now, the red mitochondria are showing in this figure mitochondria that carry DNA that is mutated in a deleterious or harmful way. Okay, and what we're seeing is that when this female organism or female human, for example, goes ahead and produces actual egg cells, that the mitochondria are distributed somewhat differently between egg cell, and that those mitochondria can then increase in number, and you can get egg cells that have variable mitochondria. So this cell up at the top, in that cell, about 80% of the mitochondria carry mutant genes that are associated with some mitochondrial disease. Here they're about 50% mutant, and here only 20% mutant. Okay, when each of those combines with a sperm, and the sperm are not going to contribute any mitochondria to the new zygote, new offspring, you can get variable results with regards to how diseased or not diseased children can be. Okay, so I'm showing you this figure for a couple of reasons. The first reason is just to again reinforce the fact that mitochondria are maternally inherited. Okay, the other is to point out that that maternal inheritance can be pretty complex, and that the mitochondria within the egg cell can be heterogeneous or diverse, and that the transmission of that diversity can in fact be somewhat hard to predict. And those are the reasons that I'm showing you this slide. Now, why this can really matter and why it's well studied, or at least the topic of a lot of study in humans, is that there are many mitochondrial disorders that affect humans and also other animals. An example is something called Lee's disease. I would like you to visit the website indicated in this slide and answer the questions written here, and think a little bit about the different mitochondrial disorders that can affect humans, some of which are quite severe. As geneticists, or as physicians or genetics counselors, when we're studying maternal inheritance, which is the term commonly applied to mitochondrial inheritance, we look for particular patterns and pedigrees. And this is a pattern in a pedigree that might suggest to a genetics counselor that there's a condition associated through inheritance of the mitochondria. So the patterns are non-Mendelian in that we see both males and females affected. We see that the conditions are transmitted only from females to their offspring, to the female offspring. So if the male has the trait and the spouse doesn't, then the offspring won't have the trait. And those are patterns that suggest maternal inheritance. Now, there's a really interesting topic that's been on the news lately that some of you may have already noticed and read about, and it's the topic of three-parent babies. Absolutely fascinating. I'm not making this up. This is not science fiction. It's really a technology that we can really do today. It's being pioneered by British physicians and scientists, and I would like you to visit the links, visit these sites, and be able to explain what a three-baby parent is, and also look up the current status in Britain, whether it's actually legal to produce three-parent babies. So in addition to the inheritance of mitochondrial disorders and the topic of reproductive technology and how we could perhaps get babies that don't have mitochondrial disorders that otherwise would, studying mitochondrial DNA has this other really interesting aspect, and it pertains to evolution, and particularly to human evolution. So I would like you to read the article that is at the link embedded here in this slide, and I'd like, as you go through that article, which is very slow, I'd like you to answer the questions that are written here on this slide, and be prepared to answer questions on those in future quizzes and exams. That concludes this third and final part of this online lecture.